I'm Ron Baker, Director of the Canadian Small Church Ministry Centre, sponsored by Small Church Connections here in Canada. And this is us, Canadian Small Churches in Action. Today's guest is from that beautiful place of Abbotsford, BC. I love it. I've been there before. I've had relatives who live there. It is a beautiful place. It also is a place where reality happens. And we're going to hear a little bit of that reality today as our special guest speaks. Now, I'm going to ask her a first question. The one that I usually start with is, what's your name? And what's been your ministry journey, your ministry background over these last number of years?
So my name is Lydia Fawcett, and I work at MCC in Abbotsford, British Columbia. So it's MCCBC. And I work in a local program called End Abuse. And I've been here for 6+ years. Prior to that, I did other things. I worked in the government, I worked in the Yukon, I worked in BC, other things. And I also was the Dean of Women many years ago at Columbia Bible College.
Really? All right.
Anyway, and Columbia Bible College is in Abbotsford. So Abbotsford has been a place where I have lived, Abbotsford, Chilliwack, Fraser Valley. But back to MCC, I retired from a career with the government in child welfare and found that retirement was less than delightful. So began volunteering at MCC. And when an opportunity came up to apply for a job, I did. And surprisingly, I was hired, and this has been the best job of my life so far. So what we do at End Abuse is we work with individual women, individual men. We have groups for them, support groups for them. If the women who've experienced intimate partner violence and men who want to change their ways, who want to be accountable for their behavior. And we also work with churches. We talk to churches, we support churches, we support situations that are difficult in churches around different kinds of abuse. And we try to create resources for churches and other organizations so that as they walk through challenging situations, they're not alone in doing that and they have some help.
Now, this podcast is a podcast about small churches. And I think sometimes we think, well, small churches are small. There can't be anything that happens in them. They're all good. And yet small churches are based around relationships, and relationships can go sour. What would you, if you were to begin with thinking about small churches and dealing with small churches and the End Abuse program that you're using, how might you connect that?
Well, I think that, one, I love small churches. Early on in many years ago in my married life, we lived in Williams Lake and went to an evangelical free church, which was a small church.
Oh, yeah.
We developed very good relationships with people there and loved it. When I arrived there, actually, it was about the second Sunday, I heard about a situation of abuse, which was sexual in nature, which was by a Sunday school leader to a child. And he was also a very well-known person in the community because he was a counselor. Child CMHA is where he worked. Anyway, and so I realized that church, that was many years ago. We're talking over 30 years ago. And so the church had to do some work around making sure children were protected, making sure that adults were understanding what boundaries were, etc. So that was kind of the beginning of understanding that situations of abuse can happen in any church, large, small, rural, urban, anywhere, any denomination, and not just churches. In fact, we've had women here who say that it happens in their Sikh temples. So it is across the spectrum. It's not Christian-based, it's not non-Christian, it's in the church, out of the church, in Jewish temples, it's everywhere. So one thing that I would say for churches, small churches in particular, is learn what you can. Listen deeply. Find resources to help you learn, and actually have conversations with people about boundaries, about good living. And regardless of theologically where you stand around women and men's roles, I don't think that quite frankly matters. I think what matters is that we are following the Christ way. And if we really read how Christ interacted with women and with men, he was supportive of all. And so I think that for small churches, one, don't believe everything you hear right away, and yet believe everything you hear. Like, hold your hands open when you're walking with people in difficult situations, but find resources and find help outside of yourself. Sometimes it's good to have other connections, right?
There seems to be a history, I'll say over the last 50, 60 years, but it certainly goes decades and probably centuries back to, of finding a way to cover over what has happened. Is that a good thing?
No, I think, I mean, I think there are places where we talk openly about everything, and there are places where we don't.
Mhm.
I think that it's important for truth to be told. So, like we tell the women in our groups, there are children who need to know what's going on, but they need to know at their level. They don't need all of the details. They need some of them. They need to know the truth to the ability that they're able to hear it. I think in a church, it's important to have truth. But if there's a situation where there's a victim and a perpetrator, I always believe it's the victim that should have control of their story. If they want to tell their story, they should be able to tell their story. Often, though, I have to say that in situations of abuse, whether it's sexual, whether it's bullying, whatever kind of abuse it is, there's often shame attached to it. Lots of shame, lots of fear. And so truth gets mixed up when there's shame and fear. It's hard to get to the base of the truth when that covers the story, right? And so I think it's really important to have someone in the church. In fact, I need to tell you, there's a church in Chilliwack, it's a conservative church, that asks to learn about intimate partner violence, because what they have developed in their church is a group of 12 people who have learned about alcohol and drug, depression, suicide, and other things, but they wanted to learn about intimate partner violence. And the reason they wanted to learn about is they want about 5 people in a church every Sunday available for their congregants, so that they know a little bit about these topics, but then also have an ability to refer on, so that they can give their congregants the information they need to get to wholeheartedness, right? I was delighted and amazed, because I don't think a Mennonite church has reached out with that. And I come from a Mennonite organization. This was not a Mennonite church. This was a Dutch church. But I thought, yes, that's what we need. We need a group of people who have a little bit of a tendency to enjoy working through difficult things and dealing clearly with emotions, regardless if they're hard, regardless if they're shame, whatever they are. Hold our hands open, listen deeply, and not make judgments right off the bat. Really hear deeply, hear well, and be very curious. And then find resources to help these people to get to the wholeheartedness that Christ wants us to live in.
Okay, so
So I went off track there.
no, but I'm listening to the story, and right away it comes to mind, like, this church in Chilliwack will have, even by your expressing and other people expressing the idea that, well, we've got a group of people here that you can talk to, it sort of invites people then to come and to be open. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit more of some of the other welcoming ways in which a small church could go within their community or within the church itself and say, we're open to this. We want to talk about this.
Right, absolutely. So MCC and abuse, we have pamphlets that we share with our churches, and we suggest they put them in, maybe not just in the foyer, but that's a good place too, but in the women's washroom, for example, or in the men's washroom if it's about our men's program, so that people in a private way can pick them up, take them home, and read them confidentially, and then they can reach out to us individually and find out about programs we have. That's one way. Another way is to actually have a sermon about good living, about relationships, what it means to really love each other, what abuse really is, what it looks like, those kind of things. And I'll tell you about resources where people can go to gather resources and print things off of our website. The other thing is to have training. So not just a sermon, but potentially have some training in the church that allows people to know or invites people to go to other places to get training, so that they just hear that, yes, in fact, our church is open to learning about this, to talking about this, to making sure that we are a safe place for children, for teenagers, for young adults, for older adults, for older people, because there are often older people who've experienced abuse in situations and they've never spoken of it. I know because I have colleagues across Canada and we talk about this and we have people reach out to us, right? And if you look at the stats, Ron, they are kind of frightening. So the stats basically are 1 in 4 women have experienced some kind of abuse. 1 in 6 men have experienced some kind of abuse. This, and the stats, you'd think, oh, they're just outside the church, but actually the stats in the church and outside of the church are no different. They're the same. The difference is inside of the church, women and men stay longer in relationships that are very difficult, or don't talk about it at all. Now, one of the things we deal with here at MCC is we have groups, like I said. And so I work with the women and I hear their stories, and we invite women from every faith background, every socio-economic background, every place. Some of these women are from more conservative places and some aren't. And we all work together to give them information so that they have information. We don't tell them what to do. We want them to gather information so they can make better decisions for themselves and their children and their communities going forward, because many of these women are in churches, and some of them are small churches. They're not all large churches, even though we're in an urban area.
I think one thing, I mean, we've gone on talking about abuse and bullying. You know, maybe we can just back up and give a general description, definition of abuse, because I think some people would say, well, that doesn't affect me, but maybe it does. Maybe we just don't know or have a broad enough vision of what abuse and bullying would be.
So I'm just going to give you a definition off the top of my head.
All right, great.
So abuse, it can be sexual, can be physical, can be verbal, can be there can be a social thing, which is I don't want you to see your family anymore. I don't like your friends anymore. Separating them from their family and friends. That can be towards children or towards women. Generally speaking, because men are stronger and in our society have a greater ability to earn more money, generally men are perpetrators towards women. There are women who perpetrate violence towards men, so I don't want to discount that, but the average or approximate percentage that I go with is about 95% of the abuse that I hear about or that is studied is 95% women are hurt by abuse, 5% men. So when I talk about men being the abuser, I don't want to negate the fact that there are men who also have been abused, and we know that. And it can be very damaging to children. It doesn't matter where you are, whether you're male or female or whatever, it doesn't matter. Abuse is terrible. So it can be a whole range of things. It can include stalking. It can include If women have left their partner, it can include using the court system against you, just dragging you back to court, back to court, back to court. It can be IT, just using internet and all those social platforms. It can be spreading rumors about you. Probably the greatest amount of abuse that I hear from women is verbal and calling them bad names, making them believe that they're crazy, that what they're saying isn't true, and that kind of thing. Many women say, I've been gaslit, and that's a story, but we won't go there right now, but you can look it up, because gaslighting is basically saying something, but then later on when you say, well, you said that you said this, they'll say, no, I didn't say that. So it's this unfortunate not acknowledging what you said previously.
Right.
And women will say to me, I'm being gaslit, right? So it makes the women feel crazy because they think that they've misinterpreted, they've heard things wrong, they've understood wrong. So I think in the church, there's less physical violence that I've heard about. That's not to say that it's not there. Women might be hit. They might be pushed up against the wall. They might see physical violence. That's not what I hear about, although I do hear about that. I hear about more things around emotional abuse, name calling, calling people down, telling them they're crazy, not agreeing, not letting them have any say in any decision making. Yeah. So
Yeah.
I don't know if that's
Just that last sentence brings me to a question of power and control in the midst of abuse. How do you see that working in that whole area?
well, I think the abuse that I see, regardless of what it is, whether it's tiny little or whether it's really dramatic, slit throats, whatever it is, and women dying, it's all around power. And as I think, and I'm not an expert. I mean, I'm an expert in talking to women because that's what I've done. But it really seems to me we want power because we're afraid. If I'm not afraid, I don't need to be right. I don't need to have power over you. I can just stand with you. I can listen to you deeply, whether I agree with you or not. But if I'm afraid, or if I need you on my side, it's because there's something missing inside of me. I think that if I am wholehearted as Christ would want me to be, I don't need you to believe exactly what I believe. I need to love you as Christ loved you. And I need you to know that Christ loves me and Christ loves you. But whether you believe exactly what I believe, I don't think that is that important. And here I'm going a little bit in a different track, but so in a relationship, if a man and a woman believe a little bit differently about, it might be the Bible, it might be church, but it might be about what car we should buy. It might be about how we discipline our children. I think that that's a conversation. And I think that if you have two wholehearted people talking about it, you can come to an agreement. You can work your way to healthy living together and agreement and a good way of being a good parent about and deciding which vehicle you buy and deciding how you use your money and deciding how you interact with a Bible verse that you may disagree on. Like, I think that Christ wants us to be wholehearted, wants us to think critically and love each other. Wow.
I mean, certainly communication is a huge part of, well, of living together, I guess, and relationships and that type of thing. Are there any particularly, okay, I'm going to put you on the spot here.
This is being on the spot.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. What would you suggest is probably the one of the best approaches to communicating with other people? Are there, I won't call them tricks, I'll just call them devices, ways in which we can communicate well, and we're not doing it well right now. What would some of those things be?
You know, I really think that the more I understand myself, the more I get to know who I am, the better I communicate in my prayer life. As I get to know myself, then I communicate better in my prayer life. And I believe also I communicate better with others. Now, I always have my fallacies. Like I like to have things tidy. I like to have things managed well. And so I have to balance loving people with making sure that I have things managed well, and so I still have my personality that comes out. But the more I know myself, I think the better I communicate with others.
All right, let me jump into even more on the spot. I see in a sense a trend that leads to crisis proportion in relation to abuse and that type of thing within our society. And probably we could go back decades, perhaps even centuries. If you were to delve into a bit of historical reflection, how would you say we got where we've gotten to where we've gotten?
I'm not a theologian, but I read this amazing book and it was called After Christ Before Christianity. They were trying to get to after Christ died to 300 AD, right?
Oh, okay, yeah.
Because 300 AD is when Christianity became the religion of the masses and Rome took it on. Well, Rome was a very patriarchal world. Extremely. Like women were owned, slaves were owned, children were owned, men had to be powerful and strong, and etc. So it was an extremely powerful society, and it took on Christianity. I'm not sure if it took it all on. So that's why reading that book was really interesting to me, because I think that Christ actually was such a disturber of the peace for the religious society of that day, and also for Rome. I mean, that's why they killed him.
Yeah, they didn't like him very much in the end.
Like
Yeah.
no.
Okay, so you started with a book. I know you brought some other books with you,
Yes.
and maybe we can just chat a little bit about that. I hate to say it,
Resources.
but our time's running out very quickly here. So
Yes, and I could talk
yeah.
a long time about this because I'm quite passionate. Even though I told you that I like to be in the background, I am passionate about this topic. It is very important. So the work that we do at MCC, there's a group that works across Canada, and we have a website. It's hosted by Manitoba MCC, but it is called abuseresponseandprevention.ca. And
Okay.
on that website, there are all kinds of resources. I'm going to hold them up. This one is Abuse Response and Prevention. Our churches and homes shouldn't be places that hurt. A guide for faith communities. So
All
it
right.
is totally downloadable on our website. This is one called Understanding Sexual Abuse by a Church Leader or Caregiver, and we are updating it currently, but also it can be downloaded for free. Anyone can use it. We also have something called, and this one was written in 2022, and it is called Walking Together, training manual to support people in cases of church leaders' sexual misconduct. Again, this is around sexual misconduct, but it's by Carol Penner and Heather Block, and it's a manual, and you can download it. There are other manuals there, and I did not bring them all. Other books there and pamphlets there, I didn't bring them all, but they're free for anyone to use. A book that isn't an MCC book, but it's just a really good book around sexual abuse and misconduct. So, and it's written by Ruth Everhart, and it's called The Me Too Reckoning, Facing the Church's Complicity in Sexual Abuse and Misconduct. And it was written, I think, in 2020. And this book is by chapters, and she integrates scripture with story. So it's quite easy to read. There's another book I read, and it's called Trauma in the Pews, The Impact on Faith and Spiritual Practices. It was also a good little book.
Oh,
And
right.
then there's this other book I'm reading. So there's many books. You can Google and find all kinds of books online. What we're trying to do with EFC right now also, which is Evangelical Fellowship Canada, is develop a website for resources for churches, evangelical churches, camps, and also large and small churches across different denominations. Like the Abuse Response and Prevention is an MCC website. We are happy to have anyone use it, but we also want evangelical churches may feel more comfortable going to a place that has more of an evangelical focus rather than a Mennonite focus. So EFC is working on this. So eventually that will come out, because we think it's really important. We don't want to tell people how to manage situations. We want to give resources to people so that they can manage situations well. It's really around giving information so that churches are blossoming, wholehearted places for people who come with all kinds of wounds, and we can help them grow to wholeheartedness. The church is a place that is filled with people with hurt. People across our culture are hurt, while they're also in our churches. And we need skills and tools to help people.
Very true. And I'm okay. As usual, I go into these podcasts and I come away with about 1,000 more questions that we could ask as we go along. Unfortunately, as I say, we're coming towards the end. And one of the things that I ask everyone that I go into a podcast with is, if you had one single piece of advice, and it doesn't have to necessarily cover the topic that we've been talking about today, but it can, if that's where you want to go. If you have one single piece of advice for a small church pastor, a leader in a small church at this point, and looking at our context, our world right now, what would that one piece of advice be that you would give?
I think don't be afraid to learn, and listen deeply, and find good resources.
Okay, that's 3. That's good.
I know it's hard to just give one, but maybe don't be afraid is the top. Because we can be afraid of the topic. We can be afraid that something bad is going to happen, or we want to protect our church. But I think that Jesus said, God, read the Bible. There's don't be afraid, don't be afraid, don't be afraid, don't be afraid, right?
Right, yeah.
I read somewhere how many times that was in the Bible, and I can't remember, but it's many times. And so I think that's really good advice. Don't be afraid, and begin to listen deeply and research things. And if you're able to have training in church, do it.
All right. Would you like to add anything else before we
Well,
close up?
I have a story. So
Okay, yes, please.
I worked at Columbia Bible College many years ago,
Mhm.
in the 80s, so I was much younger. And there was a beloved professor there. We loved him. In fact, I was envious that I never got to be in his home group, in his care group. I was in somebody else's. So I went to the dean of students. I was the dean of women. I went to the dean of students and I said, how do care groups get picked? Like, how come I can't get in that group? And he said, well, that particular professor gets to pick his group, and that's just how it's always been. And I said, well, what's that? Anyway, a couple of years, I left. I went and worked for the government in child welfare. And a couple of years later, it came out that this particular professor was abusing women. A woman blew the whistle on him. He worked at Columbia for 17 years, was well loved. So far, there are 12 women who've come forward. Sorry. One is a friend of mine, and I know well. Well loved. And he was well loved even after people knew this had happened. So now, that was many years ago, Now jump forward to Ontario, a big church, a very large big church, Brethren in Christ. Or be in Christ now.
Yes.
The pastor was well loved, also inappropriate with women.
Mhm.
So it's not like it happens back there and it doesn't happen now. It's happening. Let's be faithful. Let's learn. Let's follow Christ.
Thank you. Excellent words and well worth the time we spent together. I have just appreciated this very, very much. Thank you very much, Lydia.
Ron, you're welcome. Thank you. So nice to